The 1960s was a major decade for the innovation and change that would not only change music, but all of pop culture. Thanks to the influx of young bands and artists from Europe during the British invasion of 1963 to 1967, rock music was reborn into the hands of more experimental and forward-looking musicians. These musicians wanted to push the boundaries of sound, song structures, and concepts, developing a new genre we now know as progressive rock. Progressive rock, or simply prog rock, is a genre of rock music that was popular during the late 1960s and early 1970s, developing from the psychedelic rock scenes in London, England. The genre is notoriously difficult to define, and there is still an ongoing discussion on which bands were progressive and which bands weren't. The best definition I could construct is as follows. Progressive music is a type of multiple different kinds of subgenres, mainly for rock, pop, metal, and jazz, that exist to be atypical and non-simplistic, combining past and future musical ideas and structures with the intent to push music forward, often through classical and/or jazz influences and experimentation. This often includes odd time signatures, lengthy song durations, challenging of the form, and fantasy or concept-based albums and lyrics. Though it is often difficult to determine one key beginning to the progressive rock genre, many refer to the Beatles' 1967 album Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band as the first true step into progressive rock.
With Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, we hope you will enjoy the show.
It was an album that exercised the idea of album concepts and overarching themes, all the while featuring groundbreaking recording techniques, tape samples, and unique instruments. The album became one of the most iconic albums of all time, due to the intense imagery and experimentation through the track listings, and no better does the progressive nature of the album appear brighter than the symphonic and climactic closing track, A Day in the Life. The Beatles would continue to become very influential in this new wave of experimentation, with fellow contenders during this time including the Byrds, the Beach Boys, the Moody Blues, and Pink Floyd. But as the 60s began to close, world conflicts began to rise. The Vietnam War and the civil rights movements were all conflicting with the late 60s peace and love direction, and with the threat of nuclear destruction from the Cold War, it was clear that a massive shift would occur that would bring music to a more cynical route. That shift came on October 10th, 1969. Band, King Crimson. The album, In the Court of the Crimson King. Whereas much of the musical landscape at this time had just finished the summer of love with the events of Woodstock, King Crimson saw the world for its reality. From the opening ambience and sudden drop of the opening track 21st Century Schizoid Man, we are immediately dropped into a sense of urgency and destruction through heavy, distorted guitars and vocals, fast-changing tempos and lyrics that painted a fallout of nuclear destruction and a coming dystopia. Even the frightened look of the Barry Godber album artwork solidly depicts the fear and urgency to come. The entire album consisted of only 5 songs, with each planting a seed for a different kind of progressive rock. With the innovations made by the Beatles and King Crimson alike, many progressive bands began to rise out of various English locations. King Crimson frontman Greg Lake left the band to pursue another, more complex prog band as part of a supergroup with Keith Emerson of The Nice and Carl Palmer of The Crazy World of Arthur Brown, aptly named Emerson, Lake, and Palmer. From London, England came Yes, with highly respected musicians such as Rick Wakeman on keys, Chris Squire on bass, John Anderson on vocals, Steve Howe on guitar, and Bill Bruford on drums. The latter of which would go on to join a new incarnation of King Crimson with founding member Robert Fripp and future Asia frontman John Wetton.
A flower?
If you go down to
Out of the Charterhouse boarding school in Surrey, England, came Genesis, fronted by iconic experimental artist Peter Gabriel, and joined by such talent as Phil Collins on drums, Steve Hackett on lead guitar, Mike Rutherford on bass and rhythm guitar, and Tony Banks on keys. Many other bands rose to prominence during this time, such as Gentle Giant, Jethro Tull, Camel, and Egg. each with their own place and material to contribute to the genre. But throughout the entirety of the 1970s was one band that led the way for all progressive rock bands. A band driven from experimental roots that flowered in the same studios during which the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's was recorded. One that essentially gave fame to the genre and redefined what it means to be progressive, with grand concept albums, films, stage performances, and lyrics. I am of course referring to Pink Floyd. Unlike most bands in this video, Pink Floyd have consistently proven themselves to be ahead of everybody, not by any means of classical complexity or virtuoso instrumentation, but by sheer level of introspective musical direction and innovation that came decades before its time. From their late 1960s psychedelic roots, Pink Floyd with frontman guitarist Syd Barrett always looked to push for new sounds and ideas. After having lost Barrett to schizophrenia, the band recruited guitarist David Gilmour, whose unique tones and effects, combined with his legendary guitar solos, attributed to him as one of the greatest guitarists of all time. Of course, the Pink Floyd feel wouldn't be complete without drummer Nick Mason, keyboardist Richard Wright, and bassist and lyricist Roger Waters, the latter of which was responsible for much of the band's biggest concept albums, such as the groundbreaking 1973 album The Dark Side of the Moon, which has since become the best-selling progressive rock album to date and has remained a record-holding 917 total weeks on the Billboard 200 charts. Following the success of The Dark Side of the Moon, progressive rock picked up a new hobby: theatrical concerts. Bands from Yes to Emerson, Lake and Palmer began putting on extravagant live shows with more musically satisfying climaxes and bridges, with new bands like Kansas and Rush beginning to rock the concert arenas with their breed of prog.
Oh, mamma mia, mamma mia, let me go.
Then came Queen, whose innovations of 16 and 24 track recording and overdubs led way to more operatic and multi-layered prog songs that managed to gain loads of success on the charts. And it's here where the genre's fate began to show. The mid-1970s proved to be progressive rock's peak in success, with many classic bands getting richer and more famous for their over-the-top stage shows and concept albums. Little do they know that it was the very thing that was killing them. In the midst of social unrest in England, many began to realize that these chart-topping prog bands weren't speaking for the middle and lower class people. What instead spoke to them was the explosion of punk rock. It is no secret that as soon as punk rock hit the top of the charts with bands like the Sex Pistols and the Clash, that prog rock was on its way out. Punk loudly voiced their hate for prog rock bands, with the Sex Pistols notably donning "I Hate Pink Floyd" shirts, and lead vocalist Sid Vicious having mocked Queen for their operatic sound. Prog bands began losing their hits and chart placements to punk and new wave bands, and there were only two ways for a band to survive. Either A, adapt to the times in a new way to be progressive, or B, simply go pop. Going into the 1980s, many prog bands were suddenly nowhere to be found, as their careers were simply finished with punk as the victor. However, the biggest bands found a way to stay relevant through shorter songs, synthesizers, catchy hooks, simpler grooves, and electronic drums. Bands like Yes, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, Genesis, Rush, and Queen all went through this route, and it seemed that prog completely died and became pop. Though their musicianship still maintained pretty strongly displayed, the spirit of what they once were was gone. Even Pink Floyd, who largely held off falling into this change and ended up writing heavier and more lyrically impactful records such as Animals, The Wall, and even The Final Cut, upon losing bassist Roger Waters, eventually succumbed to the same synthesizer sounds of the decade. Luckily, with every action in music, there is an equal and opposite reaction. When progressive rock went AWOL in the 1980s, a new breed of prog was boiling in the underground that would explode into the 1990s and 2000s. Progressive metal. Bands like Opeth, Queensryche, Dream Theater, and Tool all took the influences of their prog predecessors and combined it with their love of Black Sabbath, Iron Maiden, and Judas Priest in what essentially became a new wave of prog. To this day, progressive metal remains one of the most loved metal genres and has since brought many newer fans to revisit the greats of the older prog bands. Thanks to the genius innovations of these masterful musicians, music has come a long way. It taught us that music can go much further than simple rock beats and pop structures. If a song is too simple, put it in 7/4. If your lyrics are too boring, open up a fantasy novel. If your audience is beginning to get bored of your 20-minute songs, surprise them by coming out on stage wearing a giant flower on your head. Because no matter how strange, complicated, and obscure you may be perceived as, you'll at least be different.